On the 24th of March 1668, the Queen of Portugal, Maria Francisca of Savoy, divorced her husband, King Alfonso VI. Just 9 days later, she married his younger brother, Dom Pedro, the man who had just overthrown the king in a palace coup. It was one of the most shocking royal scandals of the 17th century. But who was the woman who became Queen of Portugal twice, as the wife of two different kings? The woman who had become Queen of Portugal on two different occasions was born as Marie-Françoise Elizabeth in Paris on the 21st of June 1646. She was the second surviving daughter of Charles Amadeus of Savoy, the Duke of Nemours, and Elizabeth de Bourbon-Vendôme, a granddaughter of King Henri IV of France. Of their 5 children, only 2 reached adulthood: Marie-Françoise herself, later known as Maria Francisca, and her older sister, Marie-Jeanne Baptiste. In 1652, while Maria Francisca was still a young child, tragedy struck her family. Her father became embroiled in a bitter dispute with his brother-in-law, François de Vendôme, Duke of Beaufort, over the Duchess of Châtillon. The quarrel culminated in a duel at the horse market in Paris on July 30th, 1652, where Charles Amadeus was killed at just 28 years old. His death left Maria fatherless and profoundly altered the course of her early life. After her husband's death, Maria chose to retire to the convent of Fontevraud. Maria and her older sister spent much of their childhood there, where she was raised by the nuns. Despite their simple upbringing, Maria received a good education here, and she wrote poetry in her adult years, and the sisters remained politically important as the daughters of the late Duke of Nemours. Eventually, their mother decided to leave the abbey, and the family returned to Paris. There, a new challenge awaited them. With no direct male heir to the House of Nemours, the question of who Maria and her sister would marry became more than a family matter. It became a political prize that would shape their futures and attract the attention of Europe's most powerful courts. Maria's mother was set on the idea of marrying at least one of her daughters into the more senior aristocracy of Savoy, the dukedom that straddled the border between modern-day France and Italy. The sisters travelled there in 1659, but the negotiations with Duke Charles Emmanuel II did not make any progress, and he ended up marrying a cousin of King Louis XIV of France 4 years later. Maria's older sister was married by then, a match having been made with Charles, Duke of Lorraine, the greatest lord of the region along the modern-day French and German border. Interestingly, the Duke of Lorraine soon refused to recognise the union, and it was swiftly annulled. Yet a parallel scheme to wed Maria to Charles Henri, Duke of Vaudemont, came to nothing. In 1664, Maria's mother died aged 49, after which the responsibility for negotiating a potential marriage fell to her great-uncle, César d'Estrées, Bishop of Laon, and a future cardinal. He soon piqued the interests of the Portuguese court, where the king since 1656, Alfonso VI, who was just 3 years older than Maria, remained unmarried. For the Portuguese, however, Maria Francisca was not their first choice. The Marquis of Sade had earlier been sent to negotiate for the hand of Mademoiselle de Montpensier, Louis XIV's cousin, who declined. It was only then, after further discussions through the mid-1660s, that Maria was selected to be the future bride of Alfonso VI. Maria's marriage treaty was signed in Paris on the 24th of February 1666. The terms of it were generous to her. She would provide a dowry of 600,000 escudos, which was deliberately set high to signify the distinction of the houses of Nemours and Vendôme relative to the Portuguese crown, but this was recoverable should the marriage end, and she was promised a vast array of lands in Portugal for her use in return for the dowry. These would be inherited on the death of her mother-in-law, Donna Luisa de Guzmán, while in the interim she would have an annual allowance from the Portuguese government towards the maintenance of her household in Lisbon. With this agreed, a proxy wedding was held at La Rochelle on the 27th of June 1666. Maria then sailed to Portugal, arriving at Junqueira on August 9, 1666. She was welcomed by the Count of Castello and escorted to the Palace of Alcantara, where King Alfonso VI and the royal court awaited her. The couple were married later that day at the church of the Flemish convent in the city. Maria was 20 years old, while Alfonso was 23. Contemporary accounts remarked on the young queen's beauty, but according to some sources, the king abruptly abandoned his bride during the wedding feast, an ominous sign that this royal marriage was in trouble from the very beginning. Maria had barely arrived in Portugal before she realised she had stepped into a world utterly unlike the life she had left behind in France. But the greatest shock wasn't the country itself, it was the man she had just married. Behind the crown was a kingdom already descending into political turmoil, with factions battling for power around a king many believed was incapable of ruling. Alfonso VI had been left physically impaired by a serious childhood illness, and contemporaries frequently portrayed him as impulsive, volatile, and ill-suited to the throne. Even after he reached adulthood, his mother had ruled as regent for years, because so many doubted his ability to govern. On top of his poor health, some accounts claim he preferred the company of rough companions, spending his days playing rowdy games and his nights roaming the streets of Lisbon, drinking heavily and terrorizing the city's residents. Not only this, but he neglected his duties as a monarch. This was especially problematic, as Portugal was declining as a nation, and the Dutch were superseding them as the colonial power in many parts of Asia and Africa. Given this, by the time Maria arrived at the kingdom, a faction had already emerged which was opposed to the all-powerful court favourite, the Count of Castello, who exerted enormous influence over Alfonso. This opposing faction was coalescing around the king's own brother, Pedro. Maria was soon caught up in this scheming. It was them who had pushed for the French marriage, in opposition to Castello's preference for a strong alliance with England. The court intrigue became a more complex matter when the Queen, who had initially got on with Castello, sought to attend the Council of State as her mother-in-law before her had done. When the Count resisted, she began to ally with the opposing faction that was building up around Pedro. Politics, however, may not have been the only thing drawing them together. Later accounts claim that, as Maria's marriage to Alfonso unravelled, she fell for his younger brother Pedro. The contrast between the brothers was striking. Pedro was handsome, charismatic and capable, while Alfonso was physically impaired and intellectually limited. But whether these accounts are true or were embellished remains uncertain. What is clear is that Castello came to view the Queen and the Infante as a dangerous alliance. Fearing they could destroy his influence, or perhaps aware of secrets that could destroy them first, both sides began manoeuvring against one another. And so, there was soon a conspiracy to remove Castello, one that was encouraged from a distance by King Louis XIV of France, who wished to undermine the Anglo-Portuguese alliance that Castello was a key supporter of at court. Maria's subsequent actions were a calculated political gamble. She made it clear that she was unhappy with her marriage, and claimed that Alfonso, who suffered from a form of hemiplegia, paralysis on one side of his body, had been unable to consummate their marriage. She did so in spite of earlier claims that she believed herself to be pregnant, creating a clear contradiction. How could she have thought herself pregnant, and at the same time claim that the marriage had never been consummated? This unfortunate question was never resolved, and was later ignored. The contradiction aside, this was the grounds for Maria's request for an annulment, and she began to assert that she would take her large dowry and return to France. Whether she was already involved in a love affair with Pedro by that time remains a point of debate. What is clear is that in September 1667, a palace coup shattered Alfonso's reign. Castello fled into exile in England, while Pedro seized control of the government. Alfonso was left king in name only, and the following year he was sent into confinement on the island of Terceira in the Azores. Stripped of all real authority, he spent years under guard while Pedro ruled Portugal as Prince Regent. Although he held power from 1667, Pedro would not officially become king for another 16 years. On the 24th of March 1668, Maria was granted an annulment on the grounds of Alfonso's perpetual impotence, which the Church declared incurable and therefore sufficient to dissolve the marriage. It was a humiliating public judgment against the king, but an even greater scandal was still to come. Just days later, Maria married her former brother-in-law, Dom Pedro, the man who now ruled Portugal in all but name. Overnight, the former queen became the wife of the kingdom's new power behind the throne, sealing one of the most extraordinary and controversial royal unions in European history. The reason why it is unclear if Maria was involved romantically with Pedro before the coup of 1667 is owing to subsequent events. Maria continued to express her wish to leave Portugal with her dowry and return home to France, even after Pedro had claimed power. Contrary to her wishes, it seems that the new government may have pressured her into remaining and marrying Pedro after her annulment was granted. This was to ensure that her dowry was retained by the government at a time of financial stress in Portugal, while the new government would retain some royal links to France and Savoy in doing so. As a result, on the 2nd of April 1668, just 9 days after her annulment was granted, Maria married Pedro. The former queen became pregnant almost immediately, and on the 6th of January 1669 she gave birth to a daughter, Isabel Louisa Josepha, for whom King Louis XIV of France stood as godfather in absentia. Despite the king's effective deposition, this was still a politically precarious time, one in which the birth helped Maria and Pedro immensely during the early years of their rule. As mentioned, Alfonso was a prisoner, but Pedro's claim to rule as regent lay on flimsy ground nonetheless. In having a child, Pedro was able to point to a potential heir should he become king one day, whereas the rumours of Alfonso's impotence meant that even if he was released and allowed to remarry, he would not have children of his own. Young Isabel would, however, be their only child. Maria then became pregnant again in 1670, but she miscarried in December after rashly travelling to confront her husband over a suspected affair while heavily pregnant. Thereafter, she was unable to conceive again. Much of the rest of Maria's life focused around her daughter's upbringing and talks over who she might marry one day, though ironically, despite as many as 17 different suitors over the years, she never married anyone. Negotiations during Maria's lifetime focused on potentially marrying her to nobles like the Duke of Anjou in France or the Prince of Parma in Italy. German candidates from the ducal households of Bavaria and Neuburg were also considered. In the end, the plans began to focus on marrying her to her Savoyard cousin, Victor Amadeus II, Duke of Savoy. After complex negotiations, a betrothal ceremony occurred in March 1681. However, at the last minute, the negotiations collapsed as the government of Savoy became cautious about the possibility that the Duke would have to go and live in Lisbon, potentially subsuming the Dukedom of Savoy to the Portuguese crown in the long run. So, Isabel would ultimately remain unmarried, becoming known thereafter as the Eternal Fiancée. The Savoy marriage was not Maria's only major political project. Between 1672 and 1674, for instance, she'd worked against Spanish resistance to secure papal recognition for her second husband as the ruler of Portugal. This was a thorny diplomatic issue, as Spain had ruled over Portugal for just over 60 years between the 1580s and the 1640s, and still had ambitions to try and reclaim Portugal one day. Pedro's potential recognition as regent of Portugal and king-in-waiting by Rome could weaken this claim. Maria's final years were overshadowed by the illness that would eventually claim her life. Many historians believe she suffered from syphilis, possibly congenital, though its exact origin remains uncertain. Some hostile contemporaries instead claimed that Dom Pedro had infected her, portraying the disease as divine punishment for her marriage to her former brother-in-law. Whatever the truth, her health steadily declined throughout the 1670s, before worsening dramatically in the early 1680s. Meanwhile, Alfonso had returned to Portugal. Years of confinement had further weakened his health, and from 1675 he lived under guard at the Palace of Sintra, where he died of a stroke on September 12, 1683, at 40 years old. With Alfonso's death, Don Pedro was finally proclaimed King Pedro II, and for the second and final time in her life, Maria became Queen Consort of Portugal. Nevertheless, Maria's second term as queen was even briefer than her first. By now, it was reported that she'd become incredibly thin and ill. She died just 3 months later on the 27th of December 1683, aged 37. She was laid to rest in the convent dos Santo Crucifixo. Her remains were only exhumed from there and buried in the royal crypt at São Vicente da Fora in Lisbon in 1912, alongside both her husbands after the convent was demolished. Maria Francisca's only child, Isabel Luisa, died unmarried in 1690, at just 21, bringing her mother's direct line to an end. 3 years after Maria Francisca's death in 1687, Pedro married Maria Sofia of Neuburg, and their many children together secured the succession. When Pedro died at 58 years of age in 1706, his son, John V, inherited the Portuguese throne. Despite the twists of her extraordinary life, Maria Francisca left behind a legacy unlike any other. She remains the only woman in Portuguese history to have been crowned queen as the wife of 2 different kings, and remarkably, one of the only known women in history to have married 2 brothers who both became kings. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Maria Francisca of Savoy. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of life down below in the comments, and if you want more royalty or Portuguese royalty, let me know down below in the comments as well. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.